Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is really a big pleasure for me to again this year, for the third time in the row, to be presenting Africa's macroeconomic outlook, its performance, and the outlook for the future in this beautiful city of Addis Ababa. With this packed room and people standing up, it's already testimony to the interests we all have to see Africa continue on this trajectory of improving performance in macroeconomic policy management, public financial management, and growth, achieving the position of second amongst all the world regions. And actually, when you look in depth, as you will see in the report, you will find that even the first is just because of historical path dependency. If you look at the performance of the continent this year that we are looking at, Africa has really outperformed most of its other comparators in the world. So my presentation will run through this amazing demonstration of resilience and capacity to grow, even in the midst of global challenges that we are also going to talk about by African heads of states and government. And I want to start with saying, let's give them a big round of applause. Then we will look at the recent dynamics in Africa's macroeconomic fundamentals, a lot of which my sister, VP Nena, has already touched on. But more importantly, we look at the key tailwinds in the global economy that we need to harness as policymakers, as business owners, and as Africans. And also the headwinds we need to be aware of and manage in terms of the risks, that downside risks that face the global economy and Africa's economy as we go forward. And then expound a little bit more on the policy recommendations which VP Nena has already mentioned. On the left here, you will see the growth performance of the continent since 2021. That red line there represents Africa's real GDP growth, estimated this year at 3.2%, slightly above the 3.4% we had in 2023, but definitely looking forward, we see that we estimate it will rise to 4.1% in 2025 and 4.4% in 2026. And 24 African countries, led by South Sudan, Djibouti, Niger, Rwanda, and Senegal, are expected to grow above 5% of GDP growth in 2025. And many of countries, including the one that is hosting us, Ethiopia, have done so well in the terms of GDP growth rates. Among the 20 fastest growing economies in the world this year, 12 of them are African. And Africa's GDP, even though it's growing at this high percentage rate, we also have to point out that it's not sufficient in terms of the quality of growth to create the amount of jobs we require in Africa, or also to break the endemic abject poverty, the vicious cycles of poverty that we have. And why is that? While Africa's population, real GDP is growing, the population is also growing. And therefore, Africa's GDP per capita has lagged the other regions as, of its competitors, as we can see in this graph as well. So here, you see that the GDP per capita growth, even though it's going to double in the year 2025 and also increase further in 2026, this year it only increased by 2 percentage points, from 0.7% to 0.9%. And despite this growth in GDP per capita, as I've mentioned, it is not enough for us to be able to lift people out of poverty. But the good news is, our anticipation and estimations from our models show that by 2026, the African economies will be at par in terms of GDP per capita growth with Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. This, again, is impressive given where we are starting from. So, but we need a number of policies to be able to address the recurrent challenges that we have in the African economies. Another key point to make is that we have regional variations in the growth. That first aggregate picture does not paint the picture in all the countries. There are a number of individual countries in Africa that has been growing above the required 7% in several years, including in 2024. But the winners here for us will be East Africa. The Eastern Africa region, due to deep economic reforms that has been implemented, but also diversification of economies and so on, has grown rapidly. So the only region that did not see a recession during COVID-19, and since then, as you see in that graph, has continued to have an upward growth consistently. But another region I want to highlight is Southern Africa region. The Southern Africa region has been one of a concern because of the structural issues in South Africa that had dragged down the growth rates in that region of the country, of the continent. But today, we can see that last year and this year and next year is actually beginning to double the rate of growth in Southern Africa region, again because of a number of reforms that has been implemented. But other regions, West Africa, Central Africa, and North Africa, are also doing very well in terms of the growth trajectory being in the positive direction. Not for West Africa, a lot because of rebounding growth due to reforms that has been implemented by the current Nigerian government, the largest economy in that region. But we still have challenges in the macroeconomic fundamentals of the continent. Inflation continues to persist and go higher and higher. So we estimate this year that inflation is estimated to rise to over 18%. But in 2026, we are going to see, in 2025, it's going to come down to 12.6%, as already presented by VP Nenna. And the same way we have regional variations in growth, in the real GDP growth, we also had regional variations in terms of the inflationary pressures that countries in Africa has been undergoing during the past year. Compared to the rest of the regions, this is a key important point to make, that compared to the rest of the regions, the inflationary pressure in Africa has remained sticky despite active policies on fiscal consolidation and tightening monetary policy by our central banks and also by our finance ministries across the continent. Those red bars there show the inflationary pressures on the continent when you consider the trends over time. And exchange rate depreciation has been seen, based on this report, as the core driver of the inflation pressures that we have seen on the continent. Most of the countries in Africa saw rapid depreciation of its currency, domestic currency, because of appreciation of the value of the dollar. So this, again, is something that we really need to look at. And several countries in Africa saw uptick in inflation, as you will find in the report. But again, just like in other indicators, several countries on the continent also maintained stable inflationary outlook or even saw reductions in inflation over time. But the point to make here is that for a number of countries on the continent, we are above the required levels to maintain macroeconomic stability. On public debt ratios, we are also seeing a decline in the gross ratios of public debt to GDP on the continent, now going down, but still higher than the pre-pandemic period. And we see that the challenges that it creating that uptick in public debt has been what we continue to talk about, the spread that we have in the Africa's risk premium, with the continent paying about 3.5% more in terms of the returns, the rates of interest that we pay. And with this, Africa is losing about $74 billion annually. Again, this is why the decision of the African heads of states to implement an Africa Credit Rating Agency is a decision in the right direction. In terms of fiscal deficits, we're also seeing weakening in the fiscal conditions of countries. I'm not going to go into much depth because of the challenges of time. And so both in the fiscal and current account positions of the continent, we need to do a bit more. But the challenge is that also it's not internal factors only that is driving these challenges within the continent. So external issues continue to create pressures on governments on the continent. So if we try to look back, not just to think about 5-year term of growth on the continent, we see that some of these trends we're talking about in terms of challenges in the macroeconomic fundamentals of the continent is systemic. So we've seen episodic growth on the continent, maintaining about 4.0% per year for the past 2 decades. But we also see that this growth rate, despite being impressive, and we're saying it's second among the other regions, is not enough to create jobs or lift people out of poverty. And this is why with the African Union Commission and AfDB, we'll be releasing a report tomorrow on key actions to be able to break these challenges that we'll continue to have on the continent. So the volatility in our GDP is because we continue to rely on commodities, and by nature, the global market price of commodities is volatile. So further diversification of our economies remain a key policy action that we need to continue to watch. External flows has also continued to decline. In terms of inflows to Africa, we have seen a rebound last year compared to what we talked about in 2024 MEO report, but FDI flows declined by 3.4%. Even our own remittances declined by 2.7% because of the new developments in the global policy arena that we see and different policies that are impacting our citizens that are in the diaspora, but also impacting financial flows to the continent. ODA also declined slowly, but it's beginning to return a little bit, but still the hoping for more ODA resources for Africa is, we need to be very, think about it carefully, especially with regard to the recent developments that we're seeing across the countries. So Africa continues to struggle to address one of the major issues that is the fundamental basis for economic growth everywhere, domestic revenue mobilization. And VP Nena has already talked about it and given us the figures. We require a minimum of about 25% of GDP growth, GDP in terms of tax revenue collection, and Africa is just about half of it, around 15% that currently. But again, this varies across countries, and even tax revenue, government revenue, is far too low to be able to drive transformation on the continent. So with all this picture, what are those upside and downside risks that we need to talk about? Ongoing disinflation in the advanced economies could come with some benefits for Africa, because again, even the inflationary pressures in Africa is sometimes due to imported inflation. And as conditions continue to improve, especially in the United States and Asia, our trading partners were expecting some pass-through effects in the coming years for the continent. Continued fiscal consolidation efforts can also bring some benefits or disbenefits, consolidation in the developed countries, but also in Africa could bring some benefits or disbenefits depending on how within the continent we marry our fiscal and monetary policy to ensure that the monetary policy stance is not going to be hurting growth, SME development, and general productivity increments within the continent. Now, we have seen successful debt treatments in some African countries, and that has led to better fiscal prudence amongst countries, and that's part of why we're seeing the debt to GDP ratio coming down. So if we continue in that effort and even do preemptive debt treatment and debt restructuring, not waiting for when we get into debt default risk, then we will be able to continue to improve the fiscal position of our countries. But stronger growth in the United States and Asia are two key areas that is supposed to be upside risks for Africa in terms of being tailwinds that can help Africa to move forward. But again, looking at recent developments in the United States, even that we need to be very careful about. So when we think about internally, what are then the downside risks? What are the headwinds we need to watch? Fiscal tightening and the looming debt crisis continue to be a balancing act for the countries in Africa. Because as we're continuing to see fiscal tightening policies on the continent, we are not seeing effective pass-through to fiscal sustainability on the continent or growth. But I have to say a word of caution. Sometimes the pass-through effects of these things take time. So there's need to continue with that fiscal consolidation and monetary tightening policies, but we need to watch the balance between effects on citizens, but also effects on businesses as we make those policies going forward. I will leave deglobalization and the geopolitics of growth and fragmentation we're seeing as a last one, because for me, this is an area where Africa really, really needs to think carefully. We all know that the global financial architecture has not been favorable to the continent, but even that global financial architecture is dismantling itself. So what do we do as Africans in order to position ourselves in this time of crisis so that we achieve what our veteran, Kofi Annan, always said, not to let any time of crisis go to waste? So we need to think carefully about how, when we're hearing friendshoring, reshoring, America first, and all the other first, how we also put Africa first. So we need to think very carefully about such policies that will improve regional economic integration and improve macroeconomic prudence in Africa and boost regional trade, regional productivity, manufacturing, and others. But there are several policies we have indicated that to address this particular risk that you will see in the reports. But these geopolitical tensions and global and regional conflicts also has a lot of pass-through effects to Africa. And again, for me, the solution to that is very clear. Our heads of states and government, for example, have already agreed on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. We need to stop having discussions on ACFTA and just get it done. We don't have time, because time for technology transfer, the windows are closing. Time for capital flow into the continent, we are seeing continued decline if you continue to watch it. So while we still have time to build alliances, do our own friendshoring and reshoring, let's do it now and not continue to have discussions. But climate shocks also continue to be a systemic risk that affects the continent in two ways. We know that the physical impacts of climate change is costing Africa 5 to 15% of GDP per capita growth every year. This is huge, more than $7.5 billion every year, addressing climate adaptation and climate mitigation issues. But another point that is subtle is that interpretation and use of climate policy has become one of the major challenges and bottlenecks, that is headwinds for financial flows coming into the continent, into critical productivity boosting sectors like energy. So we also need to think about just transitions and how we relate with climate policy in Africa and how we engage with the rest of the world to ensure that those regimes of policies are not used to upend growth on the continent. But the persistent inflationary pressures is something we have already talked about. So what are the key policy recommendations if we look at this picture that we have talked about? Macroeconomic policy reforms continue to remain an important and, in fact, a sine qua non for a necessary condition for growth to be sustained on the continent. We're doing well on GDP growth, and we can also even do much better. As you will hear tomorrow, there are key actions that if we continue to take, we will continue this path of upward growth and be able to reach that 7% mark required to break the vicious cycles of poverty on the continent. I would just say, if there's one key recommendation we need to take home from this report, is that there is no substitute for sound macroeconomic policy management and creating stability in the policy environment of our countries. To address issues of inflation, we have very clear policies that need to be considered, and it depends on the situation in each particular country. So I'll encourage you to read the report so you get the more details on what we need to do. But on a broad scale, we're saying we need to coordinate monetary and fiscal policies to make sure that we are not upending productivity growth, SME growth, private sector development by continuing to increase monetary policy rate only to manage the inflation of the country. So balancing inflationary targets, but also growth targets, is a key policy that we need to think about in Africa. But it depends on which situations countries are in. So if you read the report, you can find what relates to your own country. To address debt vulnerability and refinancing risks, there are several things that needs to be done. But again, the continent is ahead of the pack. One of them is that Africa is the only continent that doesn't have a financial stability mechanism to address debt refinancing risks, which today is costing the continent about $10 billion every year for the next 10 years. If you go even by 2030, it's continuing increasing. And that analysis is based on already contracted debt. So with more fiscal pressures and additional debt that accumulation on the continent, that refinancing risk challenges will also continue to happen. So we need to focus on debt productivity instead of debt sustainability. Debt sustainability is important, but debt productivity is even more important, because if we think about the quality of debt and the returns to the debt, borrowing only for productive investments, then we turn our debt to a growth-enhancing investment rather than the issues of we continue to think about how to repay this debt. Because if you borrow to invest and the investments creates returns higher than the principal, you are in good business. So let's think about that. We also need to pursue preemptive debt restructuring. Let's learn from the examples of Zambia, of Ghana, and the countries that have been able to do debt restructuring in the past 3 years, and the improvements in their fiscal policy prudence. Let's try to roll that out, not waiting for when it rains before we buy the umbrella. Accelerating capacity building in public financial management to ensure public prudence in the public finance management processes, from domestic revenue mobilization to budgeting to borrowing to macroeconomic fiscal policy management, is fundamental. And this is where, again, Africa is ahead of the pack. Under the leadership of President Adesina and the board of the African Development Bank Group, we've established the Public Financial Management Academy. We've also established what we call the Africa Debt Management Initiative Network, and also the Debt Management Forum for Africa, bringing all the stakeholders on managing debt and public financial management at all levels together to train, to provide technical assistance, and we're already seeing improvements that's happening in this. And then to address the current account deficit, we just need to strengthen the trade in manufactured goods, regional trade in manufactured goods. The proportion of trade, regional trade in manufactured goods in Africa today is about 6.3%. And this is 6.3% of about 15% of regional trade in Africa. It's too small. And we need to change the ACFTA to a platform that allows us to identify key potentials of particular countries in the continent where there's competitive advantage and also comparative advantage, and implement very clear policies that prioritizes Africa's goods and services. That's the only way to encourage production. So let's implement franchising, bringing foreign companies to come and invest in building those factories in Africa instead of extracting raw materials, but also let's implement what we have called preferred procurement policies for African countries to prefer Africa's products in order to create demand and make these things to go forward. We also need to accelerate domestic revenue mobilization, as we have already heard, broadening the tax base, improving tax administration through technologies and everything, but also let us focus on improving the social contract between governments and citizens. We find in our research that while we have